welcome to The Biblical Layman. My name is Ricardo Escobar. I want to first and foremost, above all, say thank you so much for taking your time to watch this video. In this video, I want to talk about Romans 8:29 through 34. There's been a lot of new interpretations on these biblical passages. Some very interesting ones, specifically from the Provisionist camp. If you've ever seen a video from Layton or from J17 Apologetics, or any of the Provisionists on these passages, you'll hear something like this, that the ones foreknown and predestined and called are those who are the apostles, are the forefathers, anyone who played a role or service to God, who was elected to service, or it's about the nation of Israel, because the word foreknown is also used in Romans 11, which is referring to Israel. And they also get this from verse 28, which says, for those who are called according to his purpose. They take the phrase according to his purpose and believe that who Paul is talking about here is all those called for a service. And the nation of Israel, they birthed the Messiah, Abraham, father of nations, who's going to bless the seed, was going to come through him. Peter and Paul, apostles chosen to preach the gospel. These are all men who provided service or were elected to service for God. And so they interpret this to mean that verse 29, those he foreknew, he predestined, he called, he justified, are only those who were elected to service, and not you, not I, not those in Rome. However, this creates a lot of problems, and it's actually very easy to refute. You see, let's start with verse 28 here. It says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So right there, you have this called according to his purpose. Now, many, especially in the Provisionist camp, believe that this call according to his purpose is about a purpose, a service, that they were elected to bring about something for God in this world. However, there are many places, and we're just going to look at one, where this phrase, according to his purpose, is not about a service. It's not about election to service, but it actually refers to his plan, his will, his purpose. Okay. His purpose to adopt a people, his purpose to call a people. When you go to Ephesians 1, I'm going to turn to Ephesians 1. And it's a great passage. We all love it, especially those in the Provisionist camp. Okay, in verse 5, he says, he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will. So this will here is not for service, is for adoption as sons. And then in verse 11, in him of Ephesians chapter 1, in him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. So when Paul here refers to those called according to his purpose, it's not just about service. It's not just to provide a service. It's actually for salvation. It's actually for adoption. It's for redemption and justification and forgiveness. And forgiveness. And we'll see that in the next verse when he talks about justification. But here's another problem. The context doesn't even allow for those who are called according to his purpose to just be people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, David, who was a king for Israel, Paul and Peter, those who played a role, the nation of Israel who brought forth the Messiah. The context doesn't allow for that, because the context, Paul is speaking to those in Rome. And those in Rome are not just Jews, but they're also Gentiles. There are Gentiles reading this letter. So those called according to his purpose, he's referring to those in Rome as much as he's referring to himself. And he's referring also to all of the elect, as we'll see in verse 29. Okay, so yes, God does elect and call people for a specific service, but God also has a purpose, a will, and a plan to adopt the people, to forgive people, to adopt, to forgive, to pour out grace and love towards people, specifically a people, his people. And so here in the context, this is not about just certain members, certain specific important people, but this is about all the elect, all those that God has called according to his purpose. Now go to verse 29 for me. It says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. Now, if this was just about the apostles and the forefathers, the nation of Israel, what is the point of saying all things work to the good of those who love the Lord and who are called for a purpose? I mean, if that's not for everybody, because those he foreknew is only about the nation of Israel, or only about the Old Testament individuals, or only these, elect for service, then why would he let them know, hey, all things work out for good to those who love God, but unfortunately, you're not called, only me, Paul, and the forefathers and those in the Old Testament are called. So it actually doesn't work out good for you, but it works out good for us. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. But again, in provisionism, the goal is not to make sense. The goal is to get away from the doctrine of election, to get away from the same questions, the same things that Paul talks about in Romans 9, that's unjust if God does this, and it's unfair, and how can he hold people responsible? Like, these are questions that provisionists ask all the time. And those are the same questions that Paul brings up to those who would object to what he is saying. So to get around election, this foreknowing and predestining, calling, justifying, glorifying is about the Old Testament. It's about those who are elected to a specific service. And that's wrong. The context doesn't allow for that. Furthermore, just keep reading. Just keep reading past 29 and 30. Go to 31. What then shall we say to these things? What things? The things he just said. If God is for us, who can be against us? Now, is that us also? Just the apostles, the Old Testament individuals? No, it's all God's people. It's all God's people. It's all those in Rome. If God is for us, who can be against us? And then jump to verse 33. Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? They're God's elect. God elected them. God is the one choosing, not you, not I. God is electing. Who can bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Do you remember verse 29? Those he predestined, he called, he justified. So God is the one who justifies his elect. Who justifies? In 34, who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died, more than that, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? That also is not about specific individuals, but it's about all the elect. So the context alone already defeats this idea that it's about the nation of Israel. It's about the Old Testament individuals. It's about the apostles or those elected to service. It just doesn't work. But also, this word foreknow does not just mean he knew them cognitively, with his, because again, God is omniscient. He knows everybody. God knew Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he also knew Ishmael and Esau. So it's not talking about his knowing everybody, but this word foreknown, just like as is used of the nation of Israel, is talking about a covenantal way of knowing, intimacy. In Genesis, I believe it's Genesis chapter 18, it says Abraham knew his wife Sarah and she conceived. Obviously, that's speaking of intimacy. And so this foreknowing is God entering into a covenant with these individuals. It's an intimacy with these individuals. And these same individuals whom he foreknew, not just the apostles, not just the fathers of the faith, not just the Old Testament prophets, but all the elect, those he foreknew, he predestined to conform to the image of the Son. And then he called. And there we see the word again, called, which was used in verse 28. Those called according to his purpose. Those he foreknew, he predestined, he called, and then he justified. Remember what we just read? It is who can bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. So he justifies and then he glorifies. And so Paul is saying all things work for our good because God foreordained it. He planned it this way. He foreknew you. He predestined you. He called you. He justified you and he will glorify you. It is as sure as done in God's mind. This is God's plan for all his elect, not just for those of the Old Testament. That's why Paul can say, in verse 31, what shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? If it's just about Old Testament saints, then what's the point of mentioning it? What would be beneficial to that? He foreknew them and predestined them and called them and justified them and glorified them, but you may not be in that category. Like, it just doesn't make sense. And it's all over Leighton's videos, but it's also in the debates and the conversations I have with provisionists on X every single day. It just doesn't make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because if they were to stay true to the text, it will say what they don't want it to say. That's why they have to go outside of the text. Which, by the way, if you haven't seen, I have a video on hermeneutical problems with provisionism. The first one, superimposing, and that's kind of what they do here as well. But they can't say in the text. They have to go outside the text. They have to bring in these ideas and really do eisegesis. They have to bring in this idea that this is about the nation of Israel. This is about the Old Testament saints. But again, what benefit would it give these individuals at Rome if this is just about Old Testament saints? And why would he say, who should bring against a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. The Old Testament saints already justified. So it just, again, this doesn't make sense at all. And it's not meant to. It's meant to distract you. It's meant to keep you away from what the text actually says. That God has a people, as Ephesians 1 says, 2 Timothy 1 also says, Romans 9 says, John 6, John 10. It's meant to keep you away from the idea that God, because of his love for his people, would redeem them and save them, predestine them, love them, call them, and justify them. Why? Because, Romans 9, that's unfair. That's not right. And that will always be one of the biggest problems with provisionism. All right, guys, I don't like to make long videos. So 12 minutes in, this is the end of the video. A lot more can be said on this topic, and I probably will make another video on this. But hopefully that was enough to, put a stop to that interpretation. And hopefully many will see this video and ditch that interpretation. Until next time, guys, again, this is a Biblical Layman. Thank you so much for taking time to watch this video. God bless you.